Hello, everybody, and welcome to week two, where we're going to talk about some of the settled societies of Southwest Asia, particularly Egypt and Mesopotamia, and we're going to try to compare them a little bit. Although there are many similarities, and the problems that they face are pretty typical for a large settled society, the way they approach them are different. So, although there is a lot of similarity, don't be lured in by the easy, broad brush strokes of history with Egypt. Egypt is a society that settles along one of the world's largest rivers, that is the Nile River. Egypt is divided between an Upper Egypt and a Lower Egypt. And although we see maps north-south, we actually should think about it in terms of topography. Upper Egypt is actually higher in elevation, thus the river flows from south to north, where it empties into the Mediterranean. So Upper and Lower Egypt were united into a single kingdom by a kind of almost mythological leader known as Narmer, sometimes referred to as the Scorpion King. No, no, not The Rock. Even The Rock wants to distance himself from that movie. So the Red Lands and the Black Lands reflect the names that were given to the Upper and Lower Egypt, respectively. And they're reflected in this kind of dual crown that you often see the pharaoh wearing, this kind of long, tall, conical, slightly sloped hat with a crown around it. So that's actually a dual crown. They set one inside the other. And they are a good case for the effects of agricultural civilization, partly because there's controlled movement. You can only go north-south generally. Anything beyond about 15 kilometers away from the river is absolute barren desert. And even just a few kilometers away from the desert, you start getting into some really sandy, unsustainable territories, very minimal scrub kind of marginal territories. So you have these natural barriers. They also show that there's a growth of armies and government with long periods of stability. There's an expansion of crops and lands with the predictable flood of the Nile. Now, by predictable, I mean within reason. There is some unpredictability, but Egyptians do try to counter that with the modification of their spiritual beliefs. Now, in the first chapter, we kind of talked about those early proto beliefs, the belief in animism, that all things have spirits that need to be appeased or tricked or somehow bound to the will of the person. That gets expanded upon and more formalized in the form of gods, which take on aspects of important, usually creatures, of the Nile. So, for instance, you might have Sobek, the crocodile headed god of evil, or you might have um, Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of death and destruction, or you might have Ra, the god of the sun, or Horus, the falcon headed god that sees all. This also helps modify some of the scientific approaches to the natural world. The Nile becomes the central part not just of Egyptian life, but also of the afterlife. It becomes a kind of almost real barrier between the land of the living, and the land of the dead. And of course, the pharaoh becomes a god. So Egypt is a large, relatively easily harvested land that allows few people to work more and more land. Why? Because the Nile brings a lot of floods, and those floods bring silt, and that silt brings nutrients, which replenishes the soil that would normally be eroded and depleted by the growing of crops. Every time you grow something, and your mom who has a beautiful vegetable garden, or your dad who's super proud of his rose bushes, will tell you you have to keep replenishing these nutrients, because eventually you're going to suck that soil dry of certain nutrients and your plants will no longer grow. So you have fewer people starving, more people living longer, larger populations, and this allows for more people to be specialized. And that specialization allows for further success. A good example would be the government. So you have the pharaoh, who is, for our purposes, going to be a king, and his nobility, the people who are important around him who help maintain his power. So that's the government, and they decide where projects are built. So everything from the pyramids, which, by the way, were not built with slave labor. They were built long before Jews made it to Egypt. So we're going to go ahead and put a fork in that one because that rumor is completely done. Um, so building of pyramids, which is a public works project, building of temples, of roads, of um, aqueducts, and other improvements that essentially create a more efficient society. You also have the warriors, which provide internal and external security and acquire new territory. The Egyptians are really good at acquiring other people's territory. Priests secure the spiritual well-being and give an illusion of control over the natural world, or at least an ability to predict it. Now, priests in many ways kind of bleed over with scholars, who's our other kind of specialized group. They expand technology and they expand our understanding of the world and how to interact with it. It is no accident, to come back to our pyramid example, that the pyramids are aligned along an axis, and that they are located where they are at a big sandstone base. And it's no accident that they are so precise in their angles and that they're so meticulously cut. You have architects and mathematicians who do nothing but math and building things. So if you don't have anything to be distracted with, no Real Housewives of Orange County, no Twitter feed, no electronics whatsoever. Basically, all you're going to do is study, and so you have that emerging. And they bleed over with the priestly caste. Priests also engage in medicine and healing and a little bit of scientific investigation. So there's a little bit of bleed over between those two. And then you also have artisans, and this is in no way a hierarchy, by the way. Artisans, scholars, and others are kind of intermingled in that slightly lower echelon. Artisans are people who are necessary for trade. Everybody from the people who weave baskets to making shoes to making clothes, who create medicines or makeup uh, or craft weapons or fishing equipment or harvesting equipment or yokes or carts or whatever, boats, you name it. Those are the artisans, the people who have specialized skills and use those skills to create products and in turn are paid to do their labor. And at the very bottom, and this is the majority of people, although a much smaller majority than would have been possible in other lands, is the peasantry, the people who give food to the pharaohs and the warriors and the scholars and all those others in one form or another, either through taxes or through trade or something like that. The peasantry is also the source of a lot of labor. As any farmer will tell you, there are cycles of growth. Once you plant the seeds and you start weeding, you don't need as much people to tend the fields as you did to plant them or to harvest them. So what do you do with this kind of population that's just kind of laying about a little bit? Well, you get them engaged in some public works, and that's where those pyramids and those temples and other great facades come from. Speaking of temples, let's stop at Kamambo Temple, which is right on the border between the upper and lower Egypt. It is a great place to kind of investigate how a lot of this specialized society plays out. Nile is both a source of life and a source of death in Egypt. Life because it allows for water, crops, transportation, fishing, hunting, you name it. Also death because of disease, floods, crocodiles, and more dangerously, hippopotamuses. I know you're laughing, but hippopotami are responsible for more deaths than crocodiles are. Because they're extremely territorial, they are very fast swimmers, and they're exceedingly aggressive. Plus, their tusks are razor sharp, so don't laugh at hippopotamuses. And also, the Nile becomes a source of mysticism and scientific learning for Egypt. It is the dividing line between the living and the dead, quite literally. All of the live, um, living, breathing cities of ancient Egypt for thousands of years are on the eastern bank of the Nile. You can farm the western bank, but the cities that are on the western bank, they're mirror images of the cities, and they are essentially giant mausoleums, giant graveyards. So, for example, the city of Cairo grew up out of a city that was already there, Fustat, and it goes on further back. And then on the eastern side, we have Giza, which is where the pyramids are. And on the western side, sorry, western side, they're on is where Giza is on the Giza Plateau, and it overlooks the Nile Valley. So, uh, get how some of this plays out in um, on the Kamambo Temple. When you enter, you see two plinths, two big uh, 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 massive columns, essentially, that have carvings on them on the inside. And on the side that is on the western portion of the temple, we have Sobek, the god of evil. He's a crocodile-headed god, and he's married to Hathor, who is the goddess of life and the goddess of agriculture, essentially. She's sometimes represented as a cow-headed god. And on the eastern side of the temple, on the other side of the door, you see the god Horus. He's the falcon-headed god. He's the god of good. He is also married to Hathor. So life is interwoven between good and evil, between death and life, between light and dark. The Nile was a source of scientific investigation and measurement as well as mysticism. Being able to predict and to a degree control the flood was important. A lot of the villages that were built along the Nile were built in such a way as to either redirect the Nile or to survive floods. When floods came, people abandoned their villages, moved to slightly higher ground until the water went away, then they moved back in. They also checked for water quality at Kamambo Temple. If the water was particularly nasty smelling or particularly sludgy, it was unsafe to drink, and so they would tell people to drink out of wells. They also influenced the city and village planning, and it helped set up the calendar. Now, the calendar is not completely scientific, and actually all of these investigations are not completely scientific. They are almost inextricably tied to some spiritual and mystical belief systems. For example, there is a thing called the Nileometer measures the flooding or potential flooding of the Nile, as well as the quality of the water. And the way that you get down to the Nileometer, because it's underground, is to go down instead of stairs through this kind of cellar covering that looks suspiciously like a crocodile laying in water. And for those of you who are visiting the temple, you might look down into the Nileometer, which has a strange keyhole shape, which would look surprisingly or unsurprisingly like an ankh, which is the symbol for life in ancient Egypt. So they were steeped in symbology and mysticism as well as engaging in scientific investigation. So the natural world is often a reflection of the spiritual world, and the Nile is both a symbolic and real dividing line between those worlds. They also develop a complex concept of an afterlife. There's judgment for your worldly actions. For example, when you die, Thoth, the god of wisdom, the god of judgment, he weighs your heart against the weight of a feather, and if you have lived a virtuous life, Your heart is light. You have no regrets. You have no sins to weigh your heart down. So you get to go on to the afterlife and live in this kind of perfect replication of the life that you had before, but without the pain, the suffering, the loss, and that sort of thing. So imagine a perfect, always awesome vacation that you get to take all the time. Do whatever you want. If, however, your heart is heavier than a feather, you are consigned to oblivion. And what is oblivion? Well, it means the destruction. It means absolute erasure. You cease to exist. So it's not a punishment. It's just you cease to exist. The human world is actually a kind of a bubble suspended under a vast cosmic ocean. And this is depicted in tombs as the starry skies are depicted as kind of starfish that you would find at the bottom of the ocean. And Ra is actually in a boat that traverses the oceans above the human world, and he brings his light across the sky. Now, in some mythologies, of course, we're talking about thousands of years of mythology, things change. In some mythologies, it's the scarab that pushes the boat forward every morning, just like the dung beetle clears out his home in the morning. Now, Egyptians did have a complex understanding of medicine. Most of the medicine, most of the texts that we find are a combination of mystic spells and poultices that are of questionable value, except some of them are legitimately good at diagnosing diseases, particularly this group of parchment called the Edwin Smith Papyrus or the Edwin Smith Papyri. They are very precise and very accurate treatment of medicine, probably from some kind of military field hospital. It talks about surgery and excising tumors, about fractures, wounds, dislocations, and things like that. They also rank anatomical importance. For example, an injury to the head is extremely important. Slightly less important is an injury to the neck. Less important is an injury to torso, and least important, of course, is injuries to arms and legs. And it's a very rational, almost scientific approach. They utilize a now extinct form of lotus, which is related to the poppy for pain management. They also utilized cannabis or marijuana for pain management. Often marijuana was soaked in goat's milk and became kind of like this greenish drink, and it would be used for pain management. So the first edible, if you will. So Edwin Smith approaches treatment or the Edwin Smith papyri. Now, it wasn't written by a guy named Edwin Smith. It's actually purchased by a guy named Edwin Smith, an American uh, Egyptian buff who was sold this set of papyri, who I'm sure the person who sold it thought it was a fake or a forgery, but it turned out to be legitimate. So there you go. So this papyri approaches treatment very meticulously in places and puts diagnoses into three different categories that we could call triage, hence the term triage, three. Okay, so there are three ways you can approach an injury, and this is again through battlefield medicine, probably where it came from. So it's an ailment or an injury which I can and will treat. So this guy has a broken arm, I can fix that arm. So it's an injury I can treat. An ailment which I will contend with, that I'm going to try to fix. This guy has a strange cough and a high fever. It could be one of many things, but I think I can fix it. And then finally, ailments which cannot be treated. And so you basically give palliative care. This guy's been disemboweled by a hippopotamus. Told you, watch out for hippopotamuses. So this guy's been disemboweled by a hippopotamus. He laid out in the sun for several hours where birds pecked at his entrails, but he's still alive. He's not going to survive. There's no way. He's not going to survive. Even modern 21st century medicine would have a hard time with that one. So they would make him comfortable and essentially wait by him for him to die, or maybe even put him out of his misery. And they used a lot of advanced treatment methods that would be surprisingly advanced for as long ago as it was. We're talking 800, 900 BCE. So palpation, in other words, feeling the chest, making sure there's no fluid in the lungs, pulse taking, smelling the person, looking at visual cues. So you're smelling for any kind of smell of rot, which would indicate gangrene. You're looking at visual cues, hemorrhaging, any swelling, that sort of thing. And they advocated using sutures for wounds. It used to be wounds were, they closed or they didn't. Either way. If the guy died and the wound didn't close, well, that's his own problem. The gods must have intended him for to die. So sutures, sewing people up. Relieving pressure and fluid from head wounds. They would drill holes in people's heads. And yes, it was painful, but yes, most people survived. How do we know? New bone growth on their skulls. Not completely closed, but hey, obviously, they lived for quite a while afterwards. Splint and immobilization for broken legs, and this is something that's interesting that's coming back, is honey as a disinfectant. Honey is a great antibiotic. If you have an open cut, I wouldn't recommend pouring honey on it and putting a Band-Aid on it, but you could. It's probably better than Neosporin. So, ailments were also cross-listed by major organs, such as the brain, the liver, the heart, and so on and so forth. This is a very, very scientific approach and gives you an idea just how serious some of these investigations were. Now, we have a problem. Egypt has a very vast time scale. To give you an example, Queen Cleopatra, who's probably the most famous leader of Egypt, was born closer to the time that man landed on the moon in 1969 than she was to the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was 2560 BCE. So that gives you an idea of just how long this society lasted. America as a nation has existed for about 235 years by now. And ancient Egypt's three kingdoms lasted nearly 12 times as long. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the only surviving wonder of the ancient world, and it was the tallest man-made structure until the 19th century. Can anybody guess what the next tallest man-made structure was? If you guess the Eiffel Tower, you're in the ballpark. All right, so uh, Egypt has these massive, incredible, great accomplishments. They also have a huge period of time that we have to deal with. So unfortunately, you're not going to get 100% of the story either from your book or from this lecture, but I'm going to give you some additional resources that you can use to explore what life was like for ancient Egyptians. Let's shift gears and go to Mesopotamia, what is now modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia is a Greek word meaning between the two rivers. Meso meaning middle, Potama means river, Ia means the land of, the land between the rivers. Okay? There we go. So Mesopotamia is home to a variety of different cultures, both native and invasive. Unlike Egypt, there are short periods of stability with wide periods or long periods of instability. So you have like Sumeria, which emerges about 3500 BCE, Acadia, which emerges about 2500 BC, Babylonians about 1800 BCE, the Assyrians, which last from about 2500 BCE to 600 BCE, and eventually there's a lot more societies that arise and fall. One of the minor tribes that arise in Mesopotamia, of course, is the Israelites or the Hebrews. Originally, it was believed to be the real first settled society of Neolithic revolution. However, we're going to challenge that when we get to China because it seems that the Indus Valley civilization as well as the Chinese civilizations may have had settled societies before Mesopotamia. However, the evidence is strong for the case of this being the place where society started. Now, a lot of you may have been to Iraq or have known people who have been to Iraq and say, well, it's all desert. Why is it called the Fertile Crescent? Why in God's name would you settle there? You got to remember, we're talking about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago that these societies emerged. So we have to be really, really careful to take into account soil erosion, climate changing, changing patterns of human terraforming. Okay, so initially the Fertile Crescent had very soft soil with very few rocks and very few deep-rooted trees, which would have interrupted plowing and making use of the soil. So the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are subject to periodic upheaval throughout this archaic period. Sometimes you have environmental problems. Unlike the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates did not flood predictably, and often they didn't flood at the same time. So you would have one river flood and then suddenly another river flood, and then sometimes both of them would flood, or sometimes neither of them would flood. So you have some instability in being able to predict those floods and being able to get out of the way and to build your cities so they could survive them. You also have political instability. Unlike Egypt, Mesopotamia never really has an empire until roughly the Babylonians. There is a little bit with the Sumerians, but it's more an agglomeration of city-states. The Babylonians really become kind of an empire in and of itself, or more of a kingdom. These city-states basically go to war with each other, sometimes ally with each other, and sometimes fall victim to invasion. Mesopotamian civilizations well, Iraq was a crossroads for thousands of years, and ancient period is no different. Linguistically, there are several different languages, unlike Egypt again. There are several different languages that provide barriers to unity, to trade, to stability. But that doesn't mean that city-states and that Mesopotamia in general didn't get their act together. Babylon, for example, the Babylonians, start off as a dominant city-state and they begin to forge an empire in Mesopotamia. They go and conquer their neighbors. And they add territory through both conquest, but also through enticing people to join, because it's much better to join the winning team than to be beaten up by the winning team and join them anyway. Eventually, it lays the foundation of one of the oldest set of laws, known as the Hammurabi Code, and it is a very simplistic approach to law. It doesn't allow for exceptions or loopholes or anything like that. And it often is referred to as the law of retribution, essentially an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth kind of thing. Very Old Testament-y. Well, it's no accident that the Babylonians influence uh, early Judaism. They are the big dog on the block, and the Israelites are teeny tiny itty bitty little teeny tribe that is relatively insignificant, or actually incredibly insignificant. There is no presumption of guilt, though, with these laws, so they presume that you are innocent, and so they allow for the introduction of evidence. So, for example, if we are in a fight and I punch you and you hit something and you lose an eye, then I've intended to harm you, and the result was you lost an eye, so therefore I lose an eye. So that person can provide evidence. If, however, we're working on a construction site and I drop a hammer and it hits you on the nose and it breaks your nose, I don't get my nose broken because it was an accident. I didn't intend to harm you. Once the verdict was reached, it was either all or nothing. There is no amelioration. Uh, for example, if you sold somebody a if you sold somebody a medicine that was intended to cure them and it turned out to be not a cure, and you made them sicker, or if you defrauded somebody, you had your nose cut off, you were sewn into a bag with a bunch of rats, and then you were thrown, all of you, into a river where the rats would panic and start biting you and chewing you until you drowned. So there you go. An all or nothing verdict. Pretty brutal, but relatively effective. Babylonians were not unfair, though. They had something called flood insurance, for example. Most of the records in Sumeria, are Babylonian, are kept on clay tablets, something they inherited from the Sumerians. And they're impressed on with a wedge-shaped reed called a stylus. and it became known as cuneiform, or we know it as cuneiform. And farmers often had to borrow money in order to make to plant their fields. And so you would borrow money and you would sign a contract, and of course the contract's on clay. Now, what happens if flood or a plague of locusts or maybe a blight or a drought affects your crop? Well, be you could declare yourself bankrupt. The gods have taken away my harvest, and you could take that debt, go down to the river, and wash that clay tablet in the river. And you literally washed away your debt. Because if you take a loan, hey, you're taking a gamble, and the person loaning you the money or loaning you the seed is taking a gamble as well. So, sorry, there is no going after somebody in bankruptcy court. The code is set in stone, by the way. The previous picture we showed a stele on it, and it's set in stone in order to prevent people from altering it by whim or misremembering it or purposely misremembering it. So in a way, it's a kind of proto-constitution that provides checks upon the power of those in power. In other words, if Hammurabi's son or his successor or even his great-grandson or successors 10 steps down the line say, well, my predecessor said this, you can go to the stone tablet and say, no, he didn't. Here it is. Here it is in black and white, well, in stone, carved in stone, so it is set. So, what Mesopotamian invention do you think you use every single day of your life? I'm using one of these inventions right now while I'm waiting for you. The Babylonians invented a numerical system called Base 60. It's a numbering system that uses 60 as a whole final number. The system was used to divide an hour, a period of time, into 60 pieces, minutes. Those minutes were then further subdivided into seconds. But it also goes further than that. A circle could have any number of degrees, couldn't it? So why does it have 360? Because it's divisible by 60. There are 6 sections of 60. 6 times 6 is 36. 6 times 60 is 360 degrees. So there you have it. The Babylonians were really good mathematicians, and their advancements still are with us today. Egypt continued to play an important part in the Mediterranean politics well into the classical period. And in fact, there are several invaders who take over Egypt for the prestige of taking over Egypt. Persia is one of them. Alexander the Great is another one. Alexander we'll talk about in a few weeks here. So they are a center of learning, of culture, of society. It is no accident that there are several libraries that grew up in what would later be known as Alexandria, the Pharos, or the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria, and the older archaic glory, however, is never really regained. They don't become a dominant player, but they become important. They're still stable. It's a very productive land. In fact, Egypt's referred to as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean throughout the classic period. It's no accident that the Persians invade there. It's no accident that Alexander the Great invades there. It's no accident that the Romans invade. Okay? The Babylonians and their associated civilizations also kind of retain their mythical glory in the new empires or the neo-empires that come afterwards. For example, there are a group of people that arise that are called the Neo-Babylonians or the Neo-Assyrians. They imitate the Babylonians and the Assyrians from the past. The Persians, for example, imitate them as well. And Babylon becomes the home of mathematical and engineering achievements that sets the bar for later societies. A good example would be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or actually it's technically Neo-Babylonian, if we're going to get really technical about it, which is not only an architectural wonder, but also a hydraulic wonder because it pumps water to the very top of this massive garden, this several stories tall garden. And it becomes more stable under the Persian empires, which thankfully stop all the internecine warfare. All right, guys, that is it for this week. Remember, you have to read chapter 2, and we're having quiz number 2 this week, which covers chapter 2, this lecture, and some of the additional resources. There is, of course, a written component just like last week, so do take your time. Remember to cite your sources, and the additional resources can help you understand the ancient civilizations better. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you again next week.